is greater? Someone who does something voluntarily, or someone who does something because they were commanded to do it? It's a fascinating question that perplexes a number of the greatest thinkers in the modern Western world, and unsurprisingly, Judaism has an opinion on this very question. The Talmud asks it, and answers resoundingly that Gadol hamatzuveh v'oseh, one who is commanded and does what they were commanded to do, is greater mishe'eno matzuveh v'oseh, than someone who does the same thing voluntarily off their own volition. Now, it goes without saying, volunteers are the backbone of loving kindness in modern society, and yet there are a number of questions we need to explore to discover that perhaps what the Talmud is getting at has a grain of truth to it. On the one hand, we could argue that someone who does something voluntarily, they're giving of their own time, of their own money and resources because they're thinking of other people and how to improve the world around them. But here's where things get complicated. When a person is commanded to do something, the absolute first natural instinctive reaction is to ask the question, who are you to tell me to do that thing? And even if I agree with your authority in this power dynamic, and I understand I'm subservient to that, why are we doing that thing and not something else? And even if I agree we're meant to be doing that thing, why are we doing it in your way and not my way, when there are a dozen other ways to do it? So when we're commanded to do things, instinctively, there's this voice of the ego, this voice of resistance where the me, the I, steps into the picture and says, who are you to tell me anything? When we volunteer for something, that voice doesn't exist. In fact, the opposite is true. We often volunteer for things that I, are passionate about, and therefore it makes total sense for us to be doing this thing. That's one. Point two is something more subtle. And that is a dilemma I believe the Western world has kind of lost sight of. Because you see, when you make something voluntary, what about the people who decide not to do that thing? How do you convince them to get up and act? You see, when they don't get up and act, they don't volunteer at a soup kitchen or to help refugees or whatever it could be, they don't feel guilty. Why? Because it wasn't compulsory to start with, it was only ever voluntary. When someone is commanded to do something, there is a sense of overriding duty that says, even if I'm not in the mood right now, or I'm tired and I have hay fever, I've still got to somehow muster myself, get up, and make that difference in the world around me. So we tend to frame volunteers as these selfless heroes, and yet when you actually take a step back, you're looking at one group of people who act because they're passionate about what they're acting on, and who aren't really learning selflessness. Selflessness is learned in that moment, when the voice of the ego says, who are you to tell me to do this, and why are we doing that, and why in this and that a way, and still conquers that voice and acts nonetheless. So maybe it's true. Someone who acts because they were commanded to act is greater than someone who does something voluntarily.